Welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. The story this evening is about a man named Albert Fish, an American serial killer, rapist, child molester, and cannibalistic, who mainly preyed on children and teenagers in and around the New York City area. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870. His parents are Randall Fish and Ellen Frances Howell. Fish's father was 43 years older than his mother and aged 75 at the time of his birth. On October 16, 1875, his father, a fertilizer manufacturer and former riverboat captain, suffered a fatal heart attack at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. His mother then put her son into St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently physically abused. However, Fish began to enjoy the physical pain brought by the beatings. By 1880, Fish's mother secured a government job and was able to remove him from the orphanage. Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle had mania, one of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital, a paternal half-brother suffered from schizophrenia, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had oral and/or visual hallucinations. In 1882, at age 12, Fish began a relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine. Fish began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress. He also started to write obscene letters to women whose names he got from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. When Fish was 20 years old and moved to New York City, he began to engage in male prostitution and taking young boys' innocence. Most of them were less than 6 years old. In 1898, Fish's mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years younger than him. They had 6 children in 1903. Fish said that one day a male lover took him to a wax museum where he was fascinated by a bisection of a human private parts and became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Several years later, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Bedden. He took Bedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It is unclear whether or not the sadomasochism was consensual on Bedden's part, but Fish's later confession implied that Bedden was intellectually disabled. Fish took Bedden to an old farmhouse where he tortured him over 2 weeks. He tied Bedden up and cut off half of his private area. Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, kissed Bedden goodbye, and left. Took first train I could get back home. Fish never heard a word about the boy again. In January 1917, Fish's wife left him for the handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish was subsequently forced to raise his children as a single parent. After his arrest, Fish told a newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. Fish began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. He also began to indulge in self-harm by embedding needles into his groin and abdomen. X-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic area. He also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it alight. Fish was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children, but he did encourage them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself. Things begin to get worse with Fish in 1919. He chose people who were either mentally disabled or African American as his victims. He claimed he picked them because he believed the police would not fully investigate attacks against them. Fish did not stop what he was doing and kept hurting girls and boys as young as 8 years old. Fish attempted to test his implements of hell on a 10-year-old girl he had been molesting. While doing these horrifying things to the children, Fish managed to still get married again to a lady named Estella Wilcox. Luckily for her, they got a divorce after only 1 week. On May 25, 1928, when Fish was 58 years old, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World about an 18-year-old boy whose family wanted him to work in the country. 2 days later, he visited the family in Manhattan, under the pretense of hiring Edward. But he really planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. He promised to hire Bud and his friend, and said he would send for them in a few days. Fish didn't show up, but he sent a telegram to the Bud family apologizing and set a later date. When Fish returned, he met Edward's younger sister, 10-year-old Gracie Bud. He apparently shifted his intentions toward Grace and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. He persuaded the parents, Delia Bridget Flanagan and Albert Francis Budd Sr., to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. They agreed. Fish then took Grace to an abandoned house he had previously picked out to use for the murder of his next victim, located in the East Irvington neighborhood of Irvington, New York. There, Fish manually strangled her to death, then decapitated and dismembered her body, and ate most of the remains over the next several days. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5, 1930, as a suspect in Grace's disappearance, accused by Pope's estranged wife. Pope spent 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22, 1930. He was found not guilty. Another one of Fish's many victims was a 9-year-old boy named Francis McDonnell. On July 14, 1924, in Port Richmond, Staten Island. He was reported missing after he failed to return home after playing catch with friends. A search was organized, and 9-year-old Francis McDonnell's body was found, hanging by a tree, in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted and then strangled with his suspenders. Sadly, he had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had almost entirely been stripped of its flesh. Albert Fish said that he intended to castrate the boy, but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. That was not the last of Albert Fish's killings either. There were many more. On February 11, 1927, a 3-year-old boy named Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in the apartment hallway at their home in Brooklyn with a 4-year-old boy named William Billy Gaffney. The 12-year-old left to go back home to his apartment, and that's when both younger boys disappeared. One of the boys, Billy Beaton, was found on the roof of the apartments. When asked what happened to William Gaffney, Beaton said, "The bogeyman took him, and Gaffney's body was never recovered." Initially, a serial killer named Peter Kudzanowski was a suspect in Gaffney's murder. Then, Joseph Meehan, a motorman on a Brooklyn trolley, saw a picture of Fish in a newspaper and identified him as the old man who he seen trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket and crying for his mother, and was dragged by the man off the trolley. Beaton's description of the bogeyman matched Fish. Detectives of the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to establish that Fish was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February 1927, and that, on the day of Gaffney's disappearance, he was working at a location a few miles from where the boy was abducted. Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth Gaffney, visited Fish, accompanied by Detective King. She wanted to ask him about her son's death, but Fish refused to speak to her. However, Fish wrote this in a letter to his attorney. The letter is actually too horrific to read. The horrible things he did to these children are unimaginable. Fish also wrote a letter to Grace's parents anonymously, which ultimately led the police to Fish. Bud's mother was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it to her. Police investigated the letter concerning the murder of Grace, and it was accurate in its description of the kidnapping and the other events, although it still was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish had actually eaten parts of Grace's body. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA, representing New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at the company told the police he had taken some of the stationery home, but left it at his rooming house. The landlady of the rooming house said that Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money and asked her to hold it for him. Detective William King, the chief investigator for the case, waited outside the room until Fish returned. He agreed to go to headquarters for questioning. While they were headed to the car, Fish pulled out a razor blade. King quickly disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters. Fish made no attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd, saying that he meant to go to the house to kill her brother Edward. Fish said it never even entered his head to rape the girl. Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Fish's defense counsel was James Dempsey, a former prosecutor and the one-time mayor of Peekskill, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Fish pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes, which included sadism and masochism, cannibalism, pedophilia, necrophilia, infibulation, and all of the things. Dempsey, in his summation, noted that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities. During 2 days of testimony, Bertham explained Fish's obsession with religion and specifically his preoccupation with the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. Bertham said that Fish believed that similarly, sacrificing a boy would be penance for his own sins, and that even if the act itself was wrong, angels would prevent it if God did not approve. The last question Dempsey asked was how the doctor considered his mental condition based on this life. Bertham simply answered, "He is insane." None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but later explained that they felt he should be executed anyway. They found him to be sane and guilty. The judge sentenced the defendant to death by electrocution. Fish arrived at prison in March 1935 and was executed on January 16, 1936, in the electric chair at Sing Sing. After entering the chamber at 11:06 p.m., he was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. Fish is said to have helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. His last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." That is the end of Albert Fish. Thanks again for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.